Everyone, welcome to session 230 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. I want to make these opening remarks really quick, but a little differently than I usually do. I want to start by asking for a couple of favors, but before I get to that, it's probably a good time to introduce the guest for this episode, and that's Dr. John Austin, who's been in the OBM trenches as a student, as a professor, as a frontline consultant for the better part of 20 years. And so from my perspective, I think this is one of the most actionable podcasts we've published here in the 230 episodes that I've done. I know that sounds a bit hyperbolic, but I really feel it's true. If you listen to this show and act on some of the suggestions that John talks about, you can improve your practice right away. So the first thing I'd like you to do, the first ask I have, is just to make sure you listen to the show right away. And then also go to John's website, reachingresults.com, and download the Results Toolkit for additional materials and supports. I have the link to that in the show notes. I would also consider picking up his book, Results, the Science-Based Approach to Better Productivity, Profitability, and Safety. The second ask I would like to make of you is that you take a few minutes to share this episode with friends and colleagues. In your workplace, you might even consider making the book or some of the messages from this podcast the focal point of some of your meetings. I really think that if you're in the business of directing the activity of other people, there are lessons in this podcast that will be immediately helpful to you. And another way of saying that is that this is not an episode just for agency owners or people in executive leadership. This is an episode for anyone who works with people, and that includes all of us. So let's get to some specifics here. What do we cover in this episode? Well, we cover the evolution of OBM practice from John's perspective over the last few decades. We talk. There's a little funny segment about why consulting in ABA organizations is a little bit more challenging than consulting in, say, industrial settings. We talk a lot about asking questions and developing relationships with others. We talk about ways to pinpoint and measure interactions with colleagues to make sure you really are reaching all the people you need to reach. We talk about how to set expectations, or in John's parlance, agree on expectations. We talk about why the book Atomic Habits bothered me. I go on a little bit of a rant there, and hopefully that makes sense in the context of the conversation. And we talk about what is a mastermind and why you might consider joining one. And then we end the show talking about John's conceptualization of both burnout and psychological safety. So again, there are lessons that abound in this episode, and I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. For more information, just go to the show notes for this episode. I mentioned it a couple of times in the podcast, and I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record, but if you really want the show notes without having to go to the website, just sign up for the email list when you get to behavioralobservations.com, and you'll get the show notes delivered directly to your inbox. We're brought to you today by Behavior University, and their mission is to provide university-quality professional development for the busy behavior analyst. Learn about their CEU offerings, including their 8-hour supervision course, as well as RBT courses and other sorts of listener-related discounts over at behavioruniversity.com/observations. All right, that's it for opening remarks. Let's get to this really fun conversation, a really informative and important conversation with Dr. John Austin.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. John Austin, welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited about this.
The pleasure's mine. As I told you in our previous correspondence, Jim Carr and Linda LeBlanc have been after me to have you on the show for a long time. And so, guys, I apologize for the latency, but I did finally listen. And I was also, my memory was also jogged by a recent appearance that you had on my friend Polly Gavoni's podcast as well. I'll put a link to that in the show notes for sure. And it was such a fun and engaging conversation. I was like, oh my gosh, why haven't I had this guy on the show? Especially after all this prompting from various sources. So happy to finally make it happen. So I'm so glad you're here. And I could tell from social media, you just had a kind of like a big, splash or tour de force at the recent ABAI conference and I got a lot of friends and colleagues who attended workshops and talks and things like that. So you have a lot to say, and I'm looking forward to getting into it all. But before we do that, John, I'd like you to start by telling us a little bit about how you discovered behavior analysis. What drew you to it? What made you want to pursue it as a career?
It's a great question. I love asking this question to friends and colleagues too, and when we do workshops, because everybody's got their own path. In many cases, people have a family member with disabilities, or friend or sibling maybe with disabilities. That wasn't my path, though. My path was, I grew up in a family where I was the only person to go to college. And so everyone around me reminded me constantly that like they worked for a living, like real work, in air quotes, and like I was going to go to college, and what are you going to do with a psychology degree, man? Like, you know what I mean? Like start earning some money. And that's all fun and true. But also what occurred to me was that, these were people who I loved and respected. And like they were working as hard as they could just to put food on the table, and they were working in manual labor jobs a lot of times. And they were working for people who were often horrible to them and abusive. And also they were put into physically unsafe work environments a lot of times. And they felt like they didn't have a choice in that. And we know now that there's tons of research outside of behavior analysis and psychology at large showing that, if you have a job with high demands and low control, you are many times more likely to have heart disease and insomnia and like diabetes and like all kinds of other like ailments, right? And health ill effects. So like, when I discovered that there was a science of work, like in OBM and behavior analysis, like, wow, we have science that could lead us to creating a more effective, happier workplace, safer workplace, psychologically and physically, and like all the results that you want. And like, so why aren't we just like getting that out there and sharing it with the world? So I discovered it just by chance in my undergrad. I took a course with a guy named Chris Anderson when I was an undergrad at Notre Dame. And he was more of a lab behavior analyst, and he did some applied work and stuff, but he turned me on to OBM. And then, that through his classes, it introduced me to John Bailey's work and Scott Geller's work, and then all of Java. And like, it was like, whoa, there's a whole world of people who are doing this work and applying it and helping others, And so I was just off to the races at that point. And that was in the early 90s, right? So like I've been doing this work for a long time. I haven't done anything else, and I don't want to. It's so fulfilling to get to help people. So, with what we know about around the science of behavior.
I see. And so obviously you pursued this in graduate school. So tell us a little bit about how that went. How did you, obviously behavior analysis is in a totally different point in time. It's some number of decades further developed than it was back at that time. I think you and I are probably about the same age, so I think we have a similar perspective about how, I guess, humble the beginnings of behavior analysis writ large, how small of a community that was back in those times. So, What made you want to pursue it at the graduate level, and where did you do that work?
Well, I wanted to. I think my undergrad teacher, Chris Anderson, really encouraged me to go to graduate school. And literally, because I was the first person to ever go to college in my family, I didn't even know that was a thing. Mm-hmm. Which is so, to think back and think about how little I knew about what to expect is crazy, right? But he encouraged me to do it because, I was really into it 100%. I loved it. I love learning. And so I was just diving into it. And then B, it was clear that you couldn't really, especially back then, you couldn't get a job doing anything that I had undergrad. So I thought of it as like work at McDonald's, or like get paid to get a graduate degree.
Right.
Twist
my arm.
So I was like, yeah, I'll take that. I went to Florida State and worked with John Bailey there. And one of the cool things on reflection, looking back at those days, was that he taught me that everything was behavior. I mean, we did a lot of work in the lab, helping people with disabilities, and in schools with teachers, and at home with parents. But we also, he taught me that, like, if there's a challenge, there's probably people involved and you probably can help, like, no matter what it is. So I found myself in a meeting, like in my first semester in the department, and what the chair was complaining about how no one would recycle like they were supposed to. And he's like, I don't know, can anybody help? And I was like, I can help, And so, like, John Bailey taught me to, like, raise my hand. I had no idea what the answer was yet, but then I looked it up in Java, and it was like, oh yeah, people have done this for many years. And so that was my first publication, actually, in Java. And I did that with Dave Hatfield and Maria Lynn Kessler, and had these amazing lab members that were just equally as engaged, So that recycling paper was just an example of raising your hand when there's a opportunity that involves people. And it's like, they're around us all the time. So yeah, so that's kind of what I learned. So I did work in disabilities and in autism, but my focus really quickly became working in organizations and becoming fascinated with leadership and management, and just like, how do we apply these concepts there? I was fortunate that during those times, Aubrey Daniels would visit our lab frequently to Florida State, like once a year, sometimes even once a semester, and he'd come and give a talk and just be available for us to learn from him. It was just such a special time that it really had a big impact on my behavior. And I later ended up working for him, and that was an awesome time. I learned so much from him and Judy Agnew and Darnell Littell and Joe Leipel, and like all these just greats in the field. And listeners, if you don't know these names, like, Google them and get some of their work, man, because I mean, it's really, really, these are great thinkers and great behavior analysts that I had the chance to learn from in my formative years.
Yeah, for sure. I had a chance to interview Aubrey a couple of years ago, actually many years ago, as I guess now I'm reflecting on it. And so if anyone wants to learn more about him and the work that he's done over the many, many years he's been at this, I'll put a link to the show notes for that episode as well. Hey everyone, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably interested in some aspect of leadership. And if you want to learn more about that and get some CEUs while you're at it, go to behavioruniversity.com and click on their BCBA CEUs button. And one of the offerings I'm looking at that they have here is Leadership as a Value, and that's by former guest Nasia Cirincione Ulizi, and it is highly rated too. Every single rating is a 5-star rating, so it's something that people really enjoyed. Lots of great comments as well. Again, you can go to behavioruniversity.com/BCBA CEUs to learn more about that that workshop, if you will. And actually, if you go to behavioruniversity.com/observations first, you'll find a promo code where you can save a bit of change on your way to picking up that CEU. They've got lots of other great stuff there as well. So while you're at behavioruniversity.com, just kind of browse around. They've got RBT trainings, supervisor trainings, live webinars coming up, mini courses in ABA, and lots more. So I hope you go over there and check it out. But in the meantime, let's get back to this interview with John.
Yeah.
So if I'm understanding your career trajectory here, you've kind of been both in and outside of academia, working in industry, but also being a college professor and things like that. Can you talk about your kind of and where are you now, I guess, as it relates to that? So talk a little bit about how you've interacted with the I guess, shall we say, the academic community versus the truly in the trenches applied OBM stuff.
Yeah, great question. So when I started Florida State, when I first got into graduate school, I started reading all of OBM, and I literally read everything there was in OBM. I was that avid. I was I literally read every single thing there was out there, every article and everything. And what I noticed was that a lot of it came from Western Michigan University. And so that got it in my head. And I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to be a professor at Western. And like, listeners, like, this is not a normal path at all, but like miraculously, when I graduated, there was a job opening at Western. And also equally miraculously, I interviewed and got the job. And so I was like, got my dream job. I only had one dream job, and that was it. And I managed to get it. So I taught at Western for 15 years, and I worked with Jim Carr there and Linda LeBlanc and, Wayne Fuqua and Al Poling and Alice Dickinson, like all the Jack Michael and Dick Malott, like all the greats, man. So that was a really cool time. And I published a bunch of papers in JABA and JOBM. I was the editor of Journal of Organizational Behavior Management for years. I was the director of the OBM network for years. And so I was kind of steeped in the whole OBM and ABA field. I taught a seminar in ABA that if I listed the names, you wouldn't believe it. Like, they're all the superstars in the ABA field now, that I was fortunate enough to have like the all-star team year after year after year coming through Western in those seminars, man. And I learned so much from all those folks. So that was my academic career. And then over time, I think I realized that my reason, like getting back to the first question that you asked, like the reason for me getting into the field was to help people. And I feel like I was doing that, but really through students, through working with grad students and through research and publications that I felt like not enough people read. And so I realized that I wanted to work directly with leaders and managers more than I was. I was doing some of that work along the way. I worked some for Aubrey Daniels. I worked some for Terry McSween and in the BBS world for behavioral science technology. And I really enjoyed that applied work, that super applied work. So I resigned from the university and started my own business, Reaching Results. And it's been 13 years, I think now, that I've been doing that full time. And I've taught hundreds of leaders in 19 countries and around the world about behavior analysis and how to use it in their everyday job to produce measurable improvements. And so I've got some specific, approaches and strategies to really get people into the actual application and measurable improvement of our leadership tactics and techniques that we all know. But I think that's one of the cool things that differentiates us from the, Bain consultants or Accenture consultants or whatever, or these folks who do leadership consulting for big bucks all around the world. They don't produce measurable improvements the way that we do. They don't understand behavior as in a profound way like we do. So that's a long answer, man. I put a lot in there. What do you
Good
think?
Stuff. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Was it scary to tender your resignation? I have to imagine being a tenured university professor, doing all this, having all this academic success, being around all this very intellectually stimulating environment, to go out into the probably one of the least secure ways of earning a living, which is consulting, and not have the attendant benefits that go along with that, and the you're working with people who are you're doing anyway. It's suffice to say it's a very different environment with very different I guess pros and cons, I suppose. Were we apprehensive about turning in that letter to your department chair?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, I remember the time, and there was about a 2-month period where I literally, every time I stood up, I thought I was going to pass out. I was that riddled with anxiety. Yeah, for sure. But the mindset was, listen, yes, I'm giving up employment for life for all practical purposes. But I'm also I'm gaining a lot potentially. There's a lot to lose for sure. And that's how we often make decisions, as we think of what there is to lose. But we often leave out the part, I think, the important part, which is like, what could you gain? What might come that you don't expect? And that's difficult. So I for me, the mindset was like, I think there's a direct contingency now to my behavior. And I've always been partial to that, like where I'm a musician. And when I was an undergrad, I was in a band and we thought, man, we're going to let's go to Chicago when we graduate and we'll just like we'll be professional musicians. And I would have loved that. And I might have succeeded, but I might not have. And there's like, I chose to go to grad school instead because I felt like there was a direct relationship between how hard you work and your level of success, And I feel like when you start a business, there is also that. I mean, there are many other factors, but like there is a very direct, like if I don't work today, I don't get paid.
I'm in exactly the same boat, and I had a very similar level of apprehension when I went into private practice over 15 years ago. So I get it, and the reason why I asked that question, I kind of suspected that I both identify with and anticipated the much of your response there, but I asked that question because there's probably a lot of other people who might not necessarily be digging their work and are considering some sort of striking out on their own in one way, shape, or form. But I do want to get into how people can dig more of their work. So to that end, I guess, and we're going to get into some topics of like employee well-being, which is kind of a kick that I've been on, or at least been thinking about as of late, things along those lines. But I guess one more foundational or background question. One of the things that when I was in graduate school and also in the 90s, we were exposed. Bill Hopkins was at Auburn at the time. He was, I see you nodding, so the audience won't see that. But, Bill Hopkins, legend in the OBM world, incredibly nice dude also. I took a behavioral safety course from him, and at various conferences we attended, if we were hanging around with him, he'd be like, "Oh, here, meet this person from the continuous learning group. Meet this person from Aubrey Daniels." It was really cool, in the way of connecting people and things like that. The impression I had at the time was that everyone who was in the OBM world of behavior analysis at that point in time, they're consulting, doing lots and lots of behavioral safety. In particular, consulting to kind of industrial, kind of multinational corporations, lots of like oil refineries and, just very dangerous workplaces and things along those lines. Fast forward, a couple of decades, and now behavior analysis has matured into this position it's in these days, where we've got these large multi-state organizations and even mom and pop organizations that have many staff. And to your earlier point of your ethos of it's all behavior, well, there's lots of problems with and challenges with staff performance and things along those lines. So can you talk a little bit about the type of industries certainly that you've consulted with, both historically as well as what you're seeing in the ABA space?
Oh yeah, for sure. I do. I work in. Well, let me describe it this way. One approach to managing your business or structuring your business, if you want to think about marketing, this may be important to some of your listeners. I mean, if you're an owner or an executive at an organization, or you're thinking about starting your own business, one approach that's important is niching to your market, right? And so, like, you want to get that just means getting specific and getting really specific about who you're trying to serve and who you want to be interacting with and who you want your clients to be. Now, when you start your business early on, like, you might not be able to do that. You got to take whatever work you can, to kind of get things rolling and stuff. But I think over time, if you're like me anyway, you find that you resonate and or you attract certain types of clients and stuff like that. And so for me, I mean, I've done work in 10 or 12 different industries and been all over the place, really. But the people I tend to attract are ABA leaders because of my background, I think, and my language kind of often slips into ABA specific language, and that feels familiar to people. But also people in manufacturing, construction, and industry. And I think that that relates to the background that I have in occupational safety and psychological safety and stuff. And I think those things are all relevant in ABA too, but those are just the groups that I tend to attract, I think, and I enjoy working with. And so that's most of my work are in those two areas.
Is it more, is it different working with behavior analysts that we have like the curse of knowledge, if you will, whereas someone who is, maybe has never taken a psychology or learning course in their life, it isn't really trying to parse what you're saying or, overthink it or whatever. They're just like, oh, that sounds cool. Okay. Praise more. Awesome. Whereas, if you're consulting to XYZ ABA, a clinic, they're going to just hyper analyze everything and like really want to do it right and really want to impress Dr. Austin and blah, 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 blah. Is there a personality profile, if you will, that you see?
Oh yeah, absolutely, man. And it's less dramatic than it used to be, though, because in business and industry, there are behavior has become popularized, right? And habit change has become popularized. I mean, you look at Atomic Habits, and almost everyone I work with has read it. And we should have written that. You know what I mean?
Okay. All right. Thank you. Because I've heard, what's it, James Clear, who wrote that?
Yeah. I've
heard him interviewed a number of times, and I'm like, and he's acting like this stuff is brand new and citing, these studies from cognitive, psychology. And it's like, as if they were just like earth shattering revelations that were just discovered. And it's like, yay. I'm glad he got that information out there.
Yeah.
And there's something that we can learn, I think, from the standpoint of dissemination in popular press media. And I think people like Steve Hayes are starting to try to, make some movement in that direction. I'm pardon my rant here, John. I'm sorry,
but that's good.
The idea there that like he would say, and I'm because I didn't expect this to come up. I don't have an example, at mind, but there's some of the things he was saying on whether on an interview. It's like that's been known for a century. Like, right. Like literally a century or whatever it happened to be, or a half a century, yeah. And it's like, so-and-so at Stanford discovered in 2015. I'm like, 2015, what are you talking about? I'm like, that's really, anyway. So pardon my my diatribe there a little bit. And I'm largely appreciative that he's at least gotten that work out there so people can start looking at things from the circumstantial point of view as opposed to the characterological point of view. But it did irk me a little bit that, and I'm not worried about behavior analysis, quote unquote, getting credit or anything like that. I'm more concerned about people getting a more parsimonious explanation of behavioral phenomena.
Yeah. That book, he did an excellent job in making it simple. Like way better than we are at making it simple. So, we missed it. We as in behavior analysts, and I kick myself every time I read it and come across it. It's like, man, I'll tell you what, it's just almost exactly what I'm teaching with different language. And yet people are like saying, hey, did you read this? I'm like, yeah, man, I wrote it. You know what I mean? Like when I'm frustrated.
Yeah. Speaking of that, it's probably not a bad time. And then people, I will have mentioned this in the introductory comments, of course, but your book, Reaching Results, why did you write it? What hole in the marketplace were you trying to fill? And did you come up with this as a not a response, but like to things like Atomic Habits? That you say, oh, we need a behavior analytic version of this. That is, and again, I didn't, the book does not scream, give me credit. And again, I don't want people to misconstrue my point here that I'm not. I don't care what you. I care about people getting information that is practical and helps them and improves their lives and things like that. And I care less so about the branding of behavior analysis. I do care about that, certainly. But anyway, I'll stop talking here and let you answer the question. So, like, what were you trying to accomplish with writing this book?
I wanted to democratize OBM. and what we know, and just get it out to the world. It's been part of my mission forever, and I've tried a lot of different alleys and avenues for that to do that. And so when I went to ABAI, I gave away 250 copies of my book. I gave it to everyone who wanted one, basically. And then we had a free Kindle download that I had people access during my invited address and stuff like that for anybody who wanted to have it. And so I'll be having more of those in the future. For sure. And I'm giving away the audiobook, so like trying all those things. But the reason that I wrote the book, aside from the kind of this idea of democratizing the knowledge, is that over the last 30 years, I've coached over 10,000 improvement projects, or been involved with teams who have coached over 10,000 improvement projects in 10 different industries. And there's a simple process that we have taught people that works like over 90% of the time. And it's behavior analysis, but it's very simple. It's a 5-step process. And it's, I learned a lot of it from Aubrey Daniels and Leslie Braxick and Bill Hopkins and Phil Chase and Julie Smith and like all the greats, John Bailey and Scott Geller, you know what I mean? And so part of it is trying to credit them as well. But it's also, this is what I've been teaching for a long time, and I haven't really written it down. And so I felt like now is a good time, because it's not only about, so there's a third reason. So the democratization to kind of, share this idea, this 5-step process that's real simple. But the third reason is that if you just read the OBM literature or the ABA literature, what you learn is that we have a bunch of tactics that are effective in changing behavior. But what you don't learn, I think, is how to deliver them. And I think that there's a big gap in what we're teaching and what we've published around that topic. And so I talk about this 5-step process in the book, but I also talk about how do you create an environment where any of this is going to work in the first place? Try to give feedback to somebody who hates you and see how that goes. Okay, so what's the solution? Well, you could just follow the steps of feedback and do the BST and the operational, or you can develop a relationship with them so that they ask you for feedback. And that's something that we have not discussed or studied very well, I feel like. So end of rant, but those are the reasons that behind writing the book. It was not a response to Atomic Habits. And Atomic Habits is inspiring. For someone to be able to take what we do and put it in such simple terms with stories around it, we need to get better at that. And so I did try to build in as many stories as I could into this book so that it was, accessible.
I think you succeeded with that for sure. It's really easy to read. There's not a lot of jargon. You could give it to you can give it to colleagues in other industries and they would have zero problems accessing it. And there's a lot of good hooks in there with good stories and things along those lines. So I think in our email correspondence leading up to this, after you had sent me the copy of it, I was like, yeah, I'm hooked right. Within the first few pages, this is cool. I'm in, and so I think you by and large succeeded. So
great.
All right. So I want to get into so I don't own a company that, I as people generally have listened to the podcast know, I don't run a clinic or anything like that or any type of agency. But I have lots of friends who do. And I hear stories, John, as I'm sure you do as well. And I hear lots of stories. So in framing these questions, I try to put myself in the mindset of not just the owners, but also the behavior analysts who are trying to supervise a team. Maybe they have BCABAs and RBTs under them and things like that. And just things aren't moving in the right direction. They're struggling and whatnot. So I've got some specific questions here, but I'd like to start with your overall process for how you engage with companies. So I'll give you a little, I guess, scenario here. I'm thinking of a mom and pop clinic, maybe 1 or 2 locations, somewhere in 15 to 30 employees. One of the things that you can't avoid when you talk about these things is the employment crisis that we seem to have right now. I'm in New Hampshire. I think the unemployment rate in New Hampshire is something like 2.1%, or and it's crazy how competitive that people are particularly for entry level positions, and so. But it's also, as you likely know, very difficult to fill the BCBA positions too. But those entry level positions are obviously critical for these organizations to operate in the way in which they're designed. And a lot of those entry level positions are also competitive with non-clinical occupations. You can get paid the same or more working at Home Depot, or other places like that, because everyone is, the market has responded to this labor shortage, and wages have risen in certain sectors to respond to that. How would so like, let's say this company that this avatar, if you will, that I'm kind of setting out here, that they have this, they've got 15 to 30 employees. They're really concerned with making their setting a really fun and engaging place to work. They know they can't outspend everybody, so they can't raise compensation to levels that would be financially unsustainable. But they're competitive. But they've lost some key staff that they really wish they didn't. They're having trouble, with training with some of the ones that they have. I think this is a scenario that lots and lots of listeners will find themselves in, either as employees or as agency owners. So, if you were to sit down with either the owners or someone in management, what would be some of the questions that you would ask? How would you what is the starting part of your process? Obviously, we can't do a full whiteboard session here on a podcast, but that would take weeks, not hours. But I'm just curious how you get the ball rolling in settings like these.
With the whiteboard exercise, that sounds fun. We should do that sometime. Okay, so there is no silver bullet for this. This is it's a tough environment that is not just in ABA. It's in large and small organizations right now. I think the exception might be in tech, where people they're downsizing and stuff like that, But so take any small business, and you're going to run into very similar kinds of problems. They're compounded by the fact that this is not easy. Like, applying ABA and delivering services it's way easier to work at McDonald's or to work at a bar or some other form of employment. And so these are real problems, and I'm not going to pretend that I have like some silver bullet solution. Sure. Right? But we do know that, there's some data to suggest that the number one reason that people leave jobs may be pay in some cases, and you may have limited control over that. But the number two reason is usually involving relationships, and it's often with their direct supervisor. I just saw a poster at ABAI from Flo's lab at Kansas, and Sandra Ruby was presenting it, and it said, they did a survey of BCBAs, and of people who have left jobs, 72% of them said they found it to be a hostile or uncomfortable environment, not just because of the work, but because of the relationships among people there. So I think that's a factor we can't ignore. And even if you have a small business where you care immensely and deeply about people, the environment you're creating might still be uncomfortable for people, and you might not even know it. So I think the first thing that I would, back to your question, like questions that I would ask, the first thing I'd want to understand is what data do you have about why people are leaving, and how are you getting that data? What are they telling you? Is it anonymous, or is it like a face-to-face interview? And let's dive into that a little bit. one organization that meets the description that you're giving, that I worked with, went down that path. And what they discovered was that a lot of people who were leaving did not have strong relationships or any real relationship with leaders in the organization. And so we got to the point where, and by the way, I think every solution is different every time. There's not going to be a one size fits all at all, because just like behavior, they're different functions and forms, right? And so we need to really understand what's going on, I think, before we propose solutions. That being said, this organization wanted to address that and make sure everyone had relationships with other people, or at least leaders had relationships with all the key people in the organization and the employees. So they wrote all the employees' names on the wall, and then the leaders each took a different color sticky note and they put it next to the name that of the person who they talked to regularly, at least, or felt like they had a relationship with. And then it was really obvious where the gaps were. Like, oh, they're like 5 people who no one ever talks to. You know, if you ask people that, they might not tell you, but if you kind of start to discover that, that can be powerful. And we also know that, like, you know, from big sources like Gallup and stuff, that 25% of people at work report feeling ignored. And if I feel ignored, I would rather be criticized than to feel ignored. Right. So like that
sounds
to me
familiar.
Striking. Right. So I think looking into the data and why, and probably doing what you can to address relationships as a first step.
All right. So that's where things get going. Okay. And I like that exercise is interesting too. It sounds pretty powerful to visualize it in that way. As far as relationship development is concerned, I can imagine that there's variability in that for perhaps understandable reasons, you know. So if I might talk more to a colleague who I have some sort of shared, some sort of shared understanding, you know. So we have kids in the same school, or we both like bass fishing, or we both, you know, like the same band, or whatever. It's easier to, as the Brits would say, get on with them than perhaps others who you have less in common with. What are some strategies perhaps to maybe kind of counteract that? I mean, again, I love the idea of visualizing that in the exercise that you just described, and that probably would allow some of the, you know, because I allow people to at least understand what's going on currently to kind of jump right out at them. But as far as kind of developing relationships with people that you may have less in common with, and maybe have a hard time relating to, and I know you read beyond the behavior analytic literature as well. So I'm curious in terms of what might be out there in terms of making some connections where in circumstances where it may be challenging to do so.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's tons of stuff out there outside of behavior analysis on this. First thing is asking questions and getting good at asking questions. And that doesn't mean yes or no questions, but it means kind of inquisitive, curious questions. Nicole Gravina and I did an ABA workshop for ABA leaders. And the whole workshop was like, here's how, like, the only one behavior you need to manage performance and to change behavior and apply OBM is question asking, basically. It was a fancier title than that, but like that was the punchline, right? And so we went through every behavior change strategy and talked about how, all right, if you do it this way, it's terrible and punishing. And if you do it this way, it's highly reinforcing and supportive. And it always involves asking questions and engaging people. And you know what I mean? It's something that we don't learn enough, I think, or talk about or study enough in behavior analysis. So there's a whole series of articles a few years back in Harvard Business Review. I don't have them off the top of my head, but like the strength of asking questions among leaders, and they did a whole series of journals on that, or volumes, issues, I should say, on that. So I think question asking is one of those things, but it goes deeper than that. I did a course for some ABA organizations where we broke down relationship building into a series of shaping steps. that came from the supervisors. And like any behavior analyst listening to this is qualified to do this, right? Like you could come up with your own set of shaping steps. I don't think ours were magical, but they worked. And the first step was really basic. It was like, okay, so just like collect data on the number of conversations you have on a day-to-day basis with your staff, and who. Like, do you talk to every person who reports to you, or just some of them? And what are you talking about? So just like be curious and collect data. Just do everything you did before. All right, now think about like what gets in the way of you having regular conversations with people. Let's remove the friction from your own behavior, so that you can have more of them. Now collect data on your behavior now. Like once you've made those changes, can you talk to every person about what? Right. And now it's like, let's think of some curious questions you can ask people the next week. Right. And so forth and so on. And eventually you get to the point where you've got a little bit of a relationship. You can start to give them positive feedback. Now, it's not realistic to never give people feedback during this whole process. Right. You've got to manage the business and manage people. But my point is like, it takes a little time before people are even paying attention to you. You know what I mean? Like you don't have any stimulus control other than like hierarchical power, which is like the weakest form. What you really want is some interpersonal stimulus control. And so, it goes back to 1990s when I first heard Aubrey Daniels at Florida State tell me that reinforcement is about relationships. And I was like, what? Like that's not in, science and human behavior.
Right.
But he meant this, I think, and so we've been unpacking it for years and like, collect some data on it, be behavioral about it, like set some clear expectations among your supervisors. Like, yes, I want you to talk to every single person every day. And let's just do an exercise. Everybody ask this question. Maybe it's like, what's the most important thing to you in life? Or I don't know, it could be anything that you don't know the answer to, and listen. And then come back and let's talk about it, like find new ways to engage people. So I can rant, I can go on for a long time, but I think it's a really deep well that we're not exploring.
I see. Well, that's a good start, and it's good enough to get people stimulated to think a bit more about this. When I interviewed Flo about a year or two ago, one of the things she clued me into is this whole world of ABA Reddit. I don't know if you've hopped on that before, but there are stories abound that, it's kind of like reviews. Like people don't, I mean, it's one of those things where I don't think people go on ABA Reddit and post about all the awesome things that are happening. So there's a bit of a, perhaps a user bias, perhaps. But at the same time, I don't check up on it too often, but when I do, I'll see things like, I haven't seen my BCBA in X amount of time, which, the propriety of that from just a clinical and an administrative perspective is another issue. It's a whole different conversation, but just from the relationship piece, it brings to the reason why this came to mind was that, how on earth are you going to develop a relationship if you never see your clinical supervisor? So yeah, that's a point well taken.
Hey, can I add something to that real quick?
Yeah.
Something I'm geeked about that we've done in manufacturing more than in ABA, but I'd love to see a study on this. And actually, I'm working on a paper for Java that mentions this too. So maybe we'll get this from two angles. But all right, so you just cued it for me. So what if we collected data from the point of view of the worker, for lack of a better term? Maybe it's the tech. Or maybe in manufacturing, they're called operators or whatever, the person at the work face, And I asked, and so we've done this where we asked them, like, when's the last time you spoke to your supervisor? And now we collect some data about that. And, what was the thing that what's the last thing you talked about? What do you remember talking about last with your supervisor? And now I've got some data and I can go to the supervisor and I can say, when's the last time you talked to your staff, each person on your staff? What was the last thing you talked about? And what do you think they said? And do they match? And guess what? They don't even come close. And so now what happens when I give information to when I've got their attention And then I give information to the supervisor about, well, like, here's what your team says you're talking about and how often. And they're like, what? Like, I can't even believe that. And right. And so, like, you see the opportunities there when you start to give feedback, bottom up feedback that's anonymous and safe, doesn't put anyone in a threatening environment or situation or anything like that. But like, it's super powerful, I think, potentially.
I've had the opportunity to do that with a team once, where I basically did that inadvertently. A colleague of mine who owns a clinic asked me to come in and speak to the staff, and I said, okay, I'll do it, but I want to do it, confidentially. I had a confidential survey and things like that, and I was transparent with everyone, saying, it's like, okay, we're going to, try to use this information to, make life better or whatever. And then some of the feedback from some of the senior management staff, when I shared that with them, it was the same thing. They're like, come on, and I'm like, right. Hey, I'm just merely the reporter here, and so exactly. I totally get that. It's pretty interesting phenomenon. And these were all, these are people with the best intentions. This was not it was by and large a pretty collegial and fun place and whatnot. And despite those attributes, they still had some communication disconnect there that kind of jumped out once you started asking those questions.
And then it's an opportunity for you to talk to behavior analysts about the causes of behavior, which is, I think, one of the things that I'm fascinated by. You get back to your question about the differences in working in ABA versus manufacturing. I'm fascinated by the fact that, we use these techniques really soundly with our clients, and then we forget about them when it comes to our staff. So we start blaming people, or like, I can't believe they said that. We get frustrated. You would never say, I can't believe the child didn't respond to my reinforcement in a frustrated way. You know what I mean? Like, it's amazing. So like our friend Linda LeBlanc is famous. In my mind, she's famous for saying, like, the quickest way to turn a behaviorist into a mentalist is to ask them about their staff's performance.
Oh, right? Yeah.
So I use that quote all the time because it's perfectly, it lays out this problem, right?
And I am guilty as charged as anyone else, so I think we've all been there and make attributions based off of non-circumstantial characteristics. So I'm saying this from a point of agreement, not judgment. So there's a bunch of different ways we can go, but one of the things I wanted to talk about, John, is so there's a lot of people, and I don't want this show just to be for practice owners, right? Because obviously behavior analysts are going to be in some position where they have to influence the behavior of a parent, a coach, a direct, support professional, et cetera. And so, a lot of these lessons you can apply to your parenting or et cetera. So, and in keeping with that, there's going to be some number of people who listen to this. And I work a lot in schools. I consult to school districts here in New England. And there's a lot of challenges in those environments for many of the reasons that we've already described, in terms of we don't have enough people. We can't provide the monetary reinforcement that we'd like to, and things along those lines. And if you look at it from a teacher who is, in charge, quote unquote, in charge, they're responsible for directing the actions and behavior of a staff, but they're not actually their supervisors in an administrative sense. So what are some ways that people can use some of these strategies here, even if they're not in industry, even if they don't have any, kind of big levers to pull, like, pay, or even, things that go really south, things like disciplinary actions and whatnot. They have like no administrative, for lack of a better word, say so, or over these staff. Oftentimes they don't even get to select the staff that they work with. And sometimes those staff are placed by others who may, have varying contingencies weighing on them, and therefore the matches are not optimal. So anyone who works in special education, right now is probably adding to this list that I'm generating here, right? So from that teacher's perspective, what are some strategies that they can use? I obviously I think the relationship building piece here will be huge. Are there other things that teachers should be thinking about as well?
So a few things come to mind. One is, this same, behaviorally speaking, this same scenario occurs in organizations where you've got a support staff who's trying to influence someone in the operations, maybe, or the execution part of the business. And they don't have any formal reporting relationship or any formal power or anything like that, right? So they can't provide discipline, they can't change the pay, they can't do any of the things that you've described in schools. So that the first thing that pops into my head is, in order to influence that person, you want to try to influence their direct supervisor. So at the schools, you might not have access to that person. I understand, but if you do, that's a great opportunity to try to influence if you can influence their direct supervisor, you can influence their behavior. That's one way to influence their behavior. The second thing that I would think about is, in the 5 steps that I describe in my book that we talked about, none of them involve punishment. It's only positive reinforcement, and none of them involve money.
Okay.
And they work 90% of the time, and they work at home, and they work at work, and they work whether you've got formal power or not. And I've demonstrated it in my clients hundreds and thousands of, literally tens of thousands of times. So, so I think it's the relationship first. You've got to set the groundwork for the person to even care about doing anything with you, as a team and working together. And then the second part is kind of how you structure it. So you want to look for something very specific. We would say pinpointed, to start to try to improve, and even better if you can work on your own pinpointed behavior too. And so then have the discussion with the person and hey, I think it's really important if we deliver reinforcement within 30 seconds of the behavior, or whatever it is,
fill in the blank thing that we want.
Something really specific, right? It could be just showing up to work on time. Or it could be showing initiative, and you got to define that out a little bit more. But that pinpointing part is really important. And then getting, so that you can get some data on it, some really simple data on it. And then you have the discussion with them. I really think that this is important for our kids and for our outcomes. What do you think? And have a dialogue about it. Because listen, you can try to impose all the behavioral technology you want on people, but they will resist if they don't agree, and they will often engage in counter control, especially if you don't have direct power over them, right? So I think we often don't have that conversation. Hey, what do you think? I think it's important, and then let's talk about it like grown-ups, and maybe we can convince each other that there's a better way. Or maybe we go with this way. And so that's the process that I teach leaders to engage in when they're agreeing on expectations with somebody.
Yeah, and that agreement word is key, right? Because I remember you writing about that it's not, it's not telling, it's agreeing for sure. That's an interesting shift on that I hadn't quite appreciated previously.
Yeah. So if you can get them to agree, and they're like, yeah, let's do this. Great. I'm going to collect some data, and then we'll talk about it every week, and we'll look at the data. You put it on a graph. If it's going up, you celebrate. Let's go have some coffee, or I don't know, maybe it's not a tangible. Maybe it's just awesome, high five. I've worked with tons of leaders that it wasn't money based at all, but you felt great when you improved. That's what you've got to be able to create, especially in environments where you don't have the money to pay bonuses. But even when you do, the bonus is less meaningful when it's just money.
For sure. One of the things I was thinking about is I've seen this from time to time, or at least heard of people talk about this, is that sometimes where, when you're pinpointing and measuring employee, an aspect of employee performance, have you had situations where employees have kind of bristled against, having their behavior measured? And what are some, I'm imagining there's probably some groundwork that probably was skipped if that was the response. Can you talk about that phenomenon a little bit?
I mean, I don't think it's a simple answer, but I think you're probably right. There probably is some groundwork that was skipped. I encounter it sometimes, even though I feel like I've laid the groundwork. Like, people don't like to be have their behavior measured if they're not used to it. It's something that we have to become accustomed to, And I think that part of the reason is that there's a fear around punishment or penalty. And so I try to dissuade them. Like, I try to talk about that openly. So when I teach, I'll give you an example. When I teach a course, there's a whole artificial system. I say artificial because it's created by me. There's a system in which we can practice reinforcement and punishment, correction and feedback and stuff like that. And it's just part of the system. So, I ask you to do homework, for example, and I measure whether you do it. And then I show you whether you've done it or not. And I show the whole class whether each person has done it or not. Publicly, right? So public feedback, and it's really clear who did the work and who didn't. The expectation was super clear. They had everything they needed. But it was also really clear that before I ever started that I was going to do it. Before they even got the assignments, that this is how it was going to work. And when we get together, I want to show everybody on, an Excel sheet that shows all the green squares of people who completed things and all the blank squares for people who didn't. And they know that that's a thing and that it's going to happen. And then they also know that, when I show it, I'm like, look, you have a job. This is something I've created, right? So don't feel so much pressure around it. But it's really clear who did the work and who didn't, isn't it? And they're like, yeah, it is, and well, he had too much time on his hands. That's why he did the work. And then they start punishing each other sometimes, It's like, okay, well, let's have a dialogue about that. Because it's just, again, it's a situation that we've created so that we can talk about all this stuff that happens anyway at work when you measure performance, but no one sees it. It's all underground and it's damaging in many cases, right? So I think it's just, it's adult conversations about why this is important and why it's valuable and why it helps. There's a really good resource, by the way, on this outside of behavior analysis that I like a lot. That's called Radical Candor.
Oh yeah.
They have a great podcast too. It's not as good as yours, but it's but
it's way more profitable.
Maybe. But it's good because they deal with a bunch of different topics around having difficult conversations. So
got it.
So I don't know. I think we all should become students of that because it's important and it's difficult. It's hard by definition.
That leads me to my next question, and this was a very specific question from a colleague of mine. There are, so the process of giving feedback and having these difficult conversations. Obviously, they're called difficult conversations for a reason, and I think. To put my personality psych hat on, there's variability in how people are willing or able to give and receive feedback. Some folks gravitate to that better than others, and we often think of it on the part of the of how people receive feedback. But this person in particular has seen a lot of people that are trying to grow it in supervisory capacities being reluctant feedback givers. Giving feedback is very aversive to them, probably for a variety of historical, learning, events, etc. What have you, I guess, both in your experience and scholarship, have learned about giving feedback? And I'd love to hear the thoughts specifically on people who are very reluctant to give feedback.
Great question. And it's funny that this is when I talk about feedback and I teach feedback, I just did a session with a manufacturer yesterday on this topic, right? And I start off by saying, oh, well, you guys have all been leaders for a long time. What works and what doesn't? And they tell you all the stuff that works and doesn't, you need to do this and you need to do that. And so I find it interesting that then they still struggle with it. And part of that is self-management. Part of it is getting yourself to say the right thing at the point of performance, when it counts, So we talk about strategies, self-management strategies, really. I mean, this is very behavioral stuff, right? Like you can know it, you can know the list that Jim Carr and his colleagues published the recent paper on, receiving feedback well, receiving corrective feedback well. And there's a great task analysis of like the behaviors that you need to engage in to receive feedback well. And yet people don't do them. So like you can know it, but doing it is a different thing. You've got to create the right environment for it to happen, right? So how do you get yourself to say the right stuff? Well, you could write it down. You could rehearse it potentially. You could think about what they might say in reaction that might be surprising to you and think about how you might respond. All those sorts of things, right? So that's like one element of it. But in keeping with the theme that we've hit on a bunch today, there's a laying the groundwork feature too to this, and I hit on that a lot in my book. But I can hit some high points of it. How do you create an environment where the person would ask you for corrective feedback is the real question, I think, that we don't ask. Like when I learned how to give feedback, it was like, be specific, tell them exactly what's on your mind, don't pull any punches, and then let them deal with it. And walk away. But I think that's
or run,
old school.
depending on the,
Or run. Yeah, I think that's an old school view, and I think it's just an inadequate understanding of behavior, right? Like you really need to measure the effectiveness of your feedback at the listener's ears, not at your mouth, right? So, and that's a radical candorism right there, like that I pulled out. But so that's what we need to think about. And so how do you create a situation where they're likely to ask you for corrective feedback and then work backward from there? So one way to do that is to make the general level of positive reinforcement very high, right? So your ratio of positives to correctives is very high at the outset. And maybe it's 100% positive. So you get into the habit of having conversations after the thing happens, whatever it is that you're observing. And yeah, let's debrief. And then you just only say positive things. Like, what if you did that for a little bit? And then they're like, pretty soon they'll be like, wait, can I do something different? Like, how do I improve? Like, can you tell me how to get better? Not everyone will do that, but like somebody will. And then you're like, oh yeah, by the way, there was this one thing, and then give them that. And so again, it's a shaping process that helps you build the relationship and build trust that you're not going to use it to club them or punish them or whatever, right? So like that's one element of building the right environment. The other element that I think is really important that we work on is like, you've got to convince them that you're trying to help them. And so behaviorally, that's a mess, right? We got to like unpack that. That could be a whole episode probably. But like, how do you convince them that you're doing this to try to help them? Well, it's going to be in your actions and like over time, not in the moment, but over time, before you're really needing to have a difficult conversation. And it's going to be in how you deal with them and the words that you use, right? And that sort of thing. So one way that you might take a step in that direction, it's a little tiny baby step, but you could ask them how you can help them. Or if you want to take a further baby step, you could ask them if it's okay if you shared an idea with them about how they might do this better.
right.
Like, what if you did that? And then they said, most people will say yes. And that gives some behavioral momentum toward something new. I mean, what do you think of all that?
I like that part of would you be would you mind hearing something, or could I tell you something about that, or could I make a suggestion? And I would have to say it's probably pretty antisocial for someone to say no if you ask nicely, and so most people, whether they want to hear it or not, are probably going to say yes, and at least on the surface you've got an entry point. So but
can I offer one more?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I learned something from Joe Leipold at Aubrey Daniels when I was doing some work there, and he was there. He's not at Aubrey Daniels anymore, but he wrote this great book. I think it's called Rapid Coaching. It's probably got a better title than that. I think I'm blanking on the second part of it. But anyway, what he said was, like, you're correct. Give them one thing but make sure the thing works. Like for them, right? So like if they actually do it, it better work. And if it does, and they try it, they're gonna ask for the next piece, or they'll accept the next piece easier, right? And I think sometimes we give corrective feedback in a thoughtless way. It takes a lot of active listening and thinking and observing of that person's behavior to find like the pivotal thing that you want to share with them. You know, if you've ever coached like kids sports, that's a great way to build your pivotal behavior observation skills. You know,
the thing about the developing the relationship and then asking permission for giving feedback and things like that. There's a book I was asked to give a talk to a company about working with parents, and I found myself again looking outside of behavior analysis, and I found this book called Clinical Interviewing. I think that's all it's called, and I'll run down the actual title of it and the authors for the show notes, as I will rapid coaching too. But it was basically from it was either from the clinical psych or the social work realm, and it was all about establishing rapport with the client to solve a clinical problem in the context of psychotherapy. But a lot of these themes are very, very, there's a lot of overlap of what you're saying and what was being talked about in this book. And a lot of it also kind of seems to blend into the aspects of motivational interviewing as well. And that's a whole other rabbit hole that I probably don't have time to get into. But anyway, so I want to mention that too. It's a great book. I think there's an older version of it that you might be able to just get online. But it's got great tools for, again, it's all in a psychotherapy context, but if you do a little bit of translation in your head as you're reading it, there's lots of good stuff in there. So, all right, I got a couple more. You've been super generous with your time here, John, and so I don't want to take all your day, but I got a couple more questions. Is that okay if we proceed?
Yeah, it's great. This is super fun.
All right. So there's this topic that I've been reluctant to talk about, just because everyone's talking about it and things like that, and I really haven't found I guess my own productive way of framing the issue. And that's this topic of burnout that you just can't, if you encounter any part of social media in the ABA space, everyone's talking, it's burnout this, burnout that, burnout. And so there's like a oppositionality part of my personality. And it's like, if everyone's talking about this, I don't want to talk about it. Right. And I don't know, that's a whole other episode perhaps, but anyway, so I guess I have a couple of things to think about, like, what is your conceptualization of burnout? Because obviously it's a construct, not necessarily a countable thing. It seems, at least from my frame of mind. So burnout for me may look very different than burnout for you. And how do we differentiate that between, I think, variations of activity level that are normal and, part of being a human being? My father was an accountant, for example, and during tax season, he left for work before I got up and got home after I went to bed. And that was his life for, 2.5 months. He was working all the time because that was, as the saying, as the cliche, that was his Super Bowl, right? Anyone who's worked in restaurants, I spent my formative years working in restaurants on the Cape, and I, like 4th of July weekend was just like this, weekend where it was just madness in the restaurant. It's super stressful and whatnot, and it's contrasted with like a Tuesday in October, right? And things along those lines. So, after a long 4th of July weekend of washing dishes and, Joe's Clam Shack or whatever, was I burnt out? Yeah. And again, I don't want to trivialize people who are actually suffering. And that's not the point of this, I guess, elongated, preamble to my question here, John. But I guess what I want to know is what is burnout from your perspective, and how do we differentiate that with the ups and downs that come with perhaps virtually any other occupation out there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not, first of all, I want to say I'm not an expert on burnout. I have done some, reading in the area, and I have some thoughts around it because I've experienced some of the effects, and also I deal with and coach and teach leaders who are trying to struggle with this and struggle through, I should say, this challenge, right, in ABA and outside of ABA. I did a workshop for BHCOE on this topic and like what leaders might be able to do to stem the tide of burnout. But there's a psychological definition of this that is beyond my capacity, right? Like I can't diagnose the, burnout or anything, but when they talk about it, they talk about a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion that's created by prolonged and excessive stress in the workplace. So it can produce feelings of cynicism or detachment, sense of ineffectiveness, and can reduce to can lead to a decrease of personal accomplishment, negative impact to well-being, job performance, work satisfaction, that sort of thing. I think of it as akin to depression, where someone might say I'm depressed, but they're not clinically depressed, and so to your point, diagnosing burnout is different from feeling exhausted or feeling overworked, I think. So some of the things I guess that come to mind for me is that some young people don't know that if you are a very high sort of performance individual and you're really striving to exceed expectations and excel in your career, there will be times when you feel like you're working too much and you're not focused on other things in your life. Like there just will be, right? And I think that it's necessary, honestly. Like, I don't know how you get to a certain level in some organizations or some industries without focusing more on work than your family for some period of time. So I think that's a reality. Like when people talk about work-life balance, maybe that's what they're talking about. We know from research literature and stuff that if you want to become an expert in any area, we've got to do at least 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. And that means, by the way, I got to work with Anders Ericsson, who created that.
Oh, really?
Malcolm Gladwell popularized it, but Ericsson did the work, right? What that means is you have to practice for 10,000 hours where you're practicing something really hard about your domain. So it's not easy, it's super hard, and you get feedback about your success and failure, and you fail a lot. So that's what that means. That's the 10,000 hours. It's not just spending time, logging in or, punching the clock or whatever. It's working actively at it. So that's hard, and it produces exhaustion. When I talked to Ericsson about how much I was working on my dissertation, I remember at the time, he was like, that's way too much. You can't withstand that. Experts can only do 4 hours of deliberate practice a day, and then they're exhausted, So think about that. And then think about how often do we take a break for ourselves? I'm part of a mastermind group for myself. There's a bunch of entrepreneurs that get together and they study all kinds of different things. But they're not behavior analysts. None of them are behavior analysts except for me. But one of them is focused on, health and well-being. And I was talking about feeling burned out at one point, and she was like, well, when's the last time you took a week off? And I was like, and she was like, no, you have to have downtime. Mm-hmm. You have to. And, that being said, exercise helps, proper diet helps, proper sleep helps. When you don't sleep enough, you eat worse, you exercise less, you feel less energy, and then you sleep worse, and then and so forth, right? And I think that is an element that contributes to this too. So like taking care of yourself really is important. But that being said, when I started reading about this for BHCOE, I was thinking like, well, we're blaming the worker. Like, okay, you got to do better self-care if you're feeling burnout and stuff like that. Well, that sounds to me like blaming the victim to me. So what can we do in an organization to make it more likely that somebody's going to do this? The real question. And I think that's one worth struggling with, whether we have the proper definition of burnout or not. If people are feeling like stressed and overworked, we should be talking about that. We should be making an opportunity to encourage them to take a little bit of time off. We should be helping them get in touch with resources like psychological resources and counseling and therapy and that sort of thing, which is also helpful. So I think that there are lots of things that we could be doing. We also can give them choice and control. And I mentioned earlier, even if you have high demands at work, if you've got more choice, that produces better impact. And you've got less choice, it's worse impact for your health and your levels of stress. So
yeah, I guess in the framing of my question, I probably came off a little bit of like Clint Eastwood, get off my lawn, and that's not the point. And perhaps the differentiation might be the chronic nature of this distress, whereas you weren't doing your dissertation for years. I mean, well, you might have been the active phase of like writing it up. But, like I remember the last days of graduate school at Auburn, I would just be in the lab, 12, 14 hours a day. I remember driving straight through a red light on the way to the vet school late at night because I just was so tired and not paying attention and things like that. So I understand. I just wanted to make sure. I wanted to circle back to my poor setup of the question there a little bit. And
no, it's okay.
But anyway,
I think you're right. I don't want to. I don't think we shouldn't overdiagnose things.
I guess the one concern I have is like, do we, are we being helpful by tacting or being I think it's important for this issue to be discussed, I suppose, on one level, and on the other level, I guess the thing I struggle with is that people might learn to tack everything as burnout when it's, the kind of manageable ups and downs that, things like, so those are the things that's the inner monologue I have about a lot of this stuff. So, but getting back to what supervisors and agencies and things like that can do, and I appreciate you kind of swinging the conversation that direction. How would one surveil their staff, if you will? How would you measure that, or how would you get a sense of whether or not people are experiencing burnout or whatever else we want to call that that we're kind of putting in this basket?
Yeah, good question. First of all, I would talk about it as I am having feelings of burnout, right? Like, so when burnout's not a thing, it's an experience, right? And so if we were to put our ACT hat on,
Sure.
We would start to think about like, okay, well, I'm experiencing feelings of burnout. What does that mean? Well, I feel really tired. All right, well, what can I do about that? I could drink more water. I could probably make sure I get enough sleep, et cetera, right? So to your question, I think the language matters. But the other thing is, I really think that it comes back to knowing your people and knowing your team. If you're a really good supervisor, you are not going to be surprised if somebody's coming to you and saying they have burnout, they're experiencing feelings of burnout, like or exhaustion. You're going to see it. You're probably going to come to them first. You're probably going to know it. You may know it before they do. And I think the same goes, by the way, for people who leave the organization. Like, you shouldn't be surprised. Like, you should know your team well enough and you're observing and listening carefully enough that like you have the feeling that something is not right, even if you don't have all the data. So that's what I mean when I'm saying like, you need to be talking to your people. It's not just like, hey, how's it going? Good. All right, next person. It's understanding them and like being being there to support them. So I think it's again, I'm a big believer in dialogue and talking about these things. A lot of people will say in response that, well, we're an ABA organization. If we're not billing hours, we're not paying the bills. Or they would say some other variant. I'm more crass about that.
Sure.
So what I would say to that is like, yes, that's true. And profitability is vital to your organization. And yet we can have a septic focus on billability and utilization and money that gets in the way of our success, So like, yeah, there's a numbers thing that every minute you're talking, they're not billing, but they're going to be doing better work if you're talking, like substantially better work, and they're probably going to stay longer. And so they're the loss aversion of focusing on the billable hours like a maniac is it produces negative downstream impact. That's what I'm trying to say.
Not to mention all the energy and resources that it takes to recruit and train new people who, if you're lucky enough to replace the people who leave, for sure.
Yeah.
John, I want to give you an opportunity to talk about anything else that we haven't covered thus far. I know we wanted to get into psychological flexibility. That's another record. Psychological safety. I think we might have hinted at that here and there. I don't know if there's more to say on that, or if that's a longer conversation that we might put aside for another time. I'll leave that to you, but
I could just say a minute on it. I mean, it's a big part of my book too, and my approach. I think that's something that we in OBM and ABA we have not studied enough, and people are and the relationships thing is another item. Now, there's some research that calls it rapport, but I don't think it's just scratching the surface at this point. There's really cool research coming out of Nicole Gravina's lab at University of Florida on the impact of asking open-ended questions and developing rapport on like discretionary effort and stuff like that. They're finding really cool ways to measure that sort of thing, but we need to do more of that. And I think psychological safety is the same idea. It's a label-y thing that we haven't really done a good job of behaviorally defining. But it really just means in a work context, will the person say what's on their mind if they have an idea, thought? And we know that 93% of people surveyed across the United States say that they're on at least one team where they can't say what's on their mind for whatever reason, right? And I think that's all about the environment that the leaders are creating. I mean, it's not all about that. We have personal responsibility and stuff, but like as far as if you're a leader and you're listening to this, the only lever you have to pull is to create a better environment where people can, say what's on their mind. Like you can't select for this and hire people only who will say what's on their mind because there's no good way to test for it, right? So, and furthermore, it's not a trait. It's a context specific behavior that happens or doesn't happen based on what you're doing. So I think there's a whole episode in that and more. And there are tons of books that are outside of behavior analysis that I could recommend. The top one is called The Fearless Organization, and it's by Amy Edmondson. And I'd get her TED Talk first because it's a summary. It's like 10 minutes. The book is like a tome. Super valuable and important, but it will take you some time to get through.
And that author is again?
Amy Edmondson from Harvard. So like she's the one who's popularized it in recent days. But I think we need to I do some work in the book trying to unpack it behaviorally. Like here's what you could say and do to create a safer environment. And I've done some workshops on that. I just did one for APBA on creating a safer environment. It was all about psychological safety. It was an hour and a half, like workshop-y type thing that's on demand through APBA. But there's tons we could do on that for sure. All but right. I do think it's like foundational and vital for the whole thing to work.
All right. So folks will just need to go to drjohnaustin.com and they can find out how to read up more about psychological safety. So in the book, John, this has just been such a fun conversation. I can't thank you enough for joining me. And again, I'm kicking myself that it's taken 7 years for me to make this happen. So, so I'll let you take us out for the advice that you'd have for a newly minted BCBA.
That's a good one. Yeah, I think, everyone says to realize that you have a lot more to learn and to get a coach. I fully endorse that. I have a coach still. You can make dramatic improvements by working with somebody like that. But the other thing that maybe no one else has said is find a peer group that you can meet with. Like Linda LeBlanc and I have been running these groups called Mastermind groups. And in ABA, I do them in safety too, occupational safety, where we get a group of people together from different organizations who are peers, and they help each other. They coach each other, and it's a facilitated kind of group. You could facilitate your own group. You could do it as dinner parties for people in town, or you could do it online, but get a group of peers together that you can work with over time and develop relationships and trust with, and you can share what you're dealing with and get input from them. It's different than a coach. It's it's a peer, right? So that peer advice and mentoring and coaching is really valuable, I think.
All right. Great advice to take us out with. Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I really appreciated the conversation.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.